Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I have a few people who I have on this podcast regularly who I can call old friends, and but not that many, to be honest. I mean, there's Tevy Troy, and I've known Chris Starwalt for a while now, but I've known our next guest and been friends with him for a good chunk of that time when I wasn't intimidated little policy gnome at the American Enterprise Institute in the 1990s. Charles Murray, who is as I've blurbed a couple of his books, I have said that he is arguably the most consequential living social scientist, and I will stand by that. And he's been on the podcast once before, but that was a while ago. He's a emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, author of Losing Ground and Coming Apart and a zillion other books. He really needs no introduction. But he hasn't been on here in a while, and that's partly on me because things have been busy. And Charles was in a funk. And then Charles got out of his funk because he found religion. Or at least that's the just so story that we're going with today. And so Charles is back on. He's a dear friend. We have lots of dear friends in common as well. And if people have a problem with that, go to hell. And I always tell people who think, how can you be friends with Charles Murray? He's such a monster. And I was like, yeah, but his wife is such a saint that as a unit, it brings him over the mean to our side. So anyway, and he's not a monster. So Charles, welcome back to the Remnant. Thanks for doing this.
I've been looking forward to this, Jonah.
Okay, so as per tradition, you have a new book out called Taking Religion Seriously. I think I can guess, but what's your book about?
Taking religion seriously. It's actually literally true. It's autobiographical. It describes the haphazard, meandering, sometimes wrong journey I've had since I watched my wife, Catherine, the saint, and by the way, I go along with that description, and I go along with taking us as a unit. We average out just fine. Well, let me back up, because it's an interesting start to this autobiography. Catherine, in 1985, had our daughter Anna, our first child together, and she announced about 3 months later that she loved Anna so much that it was hard to tell where Anna stopped and she began. And then she came up with a line that is so good that David Brooks has quoted it in public. Michael Gerson has quoted it in public. The line was this: "I loved her more than evolution required." I mean, that's your very smart, well-educated woman who is saying, I understand evolutionary psychology. I understand that, of course, mothers have to love their babies to pass on their genes. It's hardwired evolutionarily. She said, no, this is beyond that. And she decided this might be a conduit for something related to what she might as well call God. And that's as hesitant as she was at the time, because we were both absolutely typical 20th century intellectuals who had decided when we went to college and learned what was going on, the smart people don't believe that stuff anymore. Jonah, I realize this is a long answer to a very straightforward question.
This is exactly what I was trying to get at. So that's
okay,
great.
Well, also you said before we went on that I could go into rants and digressions. So
absolutely.
Okay, so continuing, we were absolutely typical. I wouldn't be surprised if you are not, have been in a similar situation. I will say parenthetically, Jonah and I have indeed been friends for more than 30 years, and I cannot recall a single conversation we've ever had about religion.
I think that's probably fair.
That includes a lot of hours, folks, which, full disclosure, we were deep enough in our cups that we weren't worried about being inhibited, but we still never came up. All right. So that was the vague beginning of her journey, which ended up with her being a very observant Quaker, not a socially active Quaker, but a spiritually active Quaker, with her kind of unreflective husband watching this going on. And it took about 10 years for me to get started. I'm slow with this kind of thing. But eventually, I was seeing the ways in which she was really enriching her life by this experience, and I wanted to participate. And it was hard for me to do so. And the book is about, it's kind of a self help book for other people like me who have never been able to get into religion. And this is a way you can do it if you are not spiritually inclined. So it's autobiographical. I had great fun reading it. But I do think that I'm talking to millions of people for whom this book can be useful.
Okay, so I know for a fact that you're not prone to malapropism and that you do not use ghostwriters, but just to correct the record, you said you had great fun reading it, and you actually wrote it as well. Maybe you didn't have fun writing it.
Actually, Catherine wrote it, but she let me put my name on it.
So, all right, so I watched your presentation about the book at AEI, where our friend and colleague Nick Eberstadt, I thought, did a pretty masterful job interviewing you about it. And I've been dipping in and out of the book amidst, the decline of Western civilization. So my plate is full these days. But so I want to get to your argument about the existence of God. Well, why don't we do that first, and then I will have my from the top rope question for you. So you went through basically, unlike a lot of people, one of the ways you got to God, it's not that rare now that I think about it, but it is rare. You got to God through science, in effect, through the data, right?
Right.
And so why don't you make the broad outline case about why you sort of took Pascal's wager and said, all things being equal, God probably is up there.
It started out with the recognition of, I hope I'm right about this, it's a hypothesis, and I have not seen anybody do systematic work on it, but the hypothesis is this, that spiritual sensitivity is a real quality in human beings. The same way that the ability to appreciate music is a real quality, and the ability to appreciate great art is a quality. I am not talking about IQ. That's a necessary thing for me to add because I'm well known for talking about how important IQ is. Lots of really, really smart people are tone deaf, or if they aren't tone deaf, they really don't get much out of music. A lot of really, really smart people go to a museum, look at a famous painting and say, and walk on without having been moved or touched by it in any way. It's different from IQ. I'm saying the same thing is true of spiritual insight. I do not have it. Our mutual friend Arthur Brooks once said, when I'd said that to him, he said, I don't have the God gene either. But he recognized that there are some people who do. And that's what's hard for you to do if you don't have it. It's the same as a tone-deaf person who actually does hear beautiful music as discordant, meaningless bits of sound. I could imagine how it will be hard for them to imagine the truth of beautiful music. Well, it's really hard for agnostics who don't have the God gene to believe that people who seem to say they have deep spiritual insights are telling the truth, that they aren't kidding themselves. I think that they are kidding themselves, and in large part, again, go back to my wife, Catherine. If you try to say to yourself, well, the reason she thinks she's having these spiritual growth experiences is because she's stupid, you don't want to do that with Catherine.
No.
Has an extraordinary intellect. And you also don't want to say, well, she kids herself. And no, you don't want to say that about her either. I had to take it seriously. So if you don't have that talent, then you have to do a workaround. And I have an analogy with me and math. My math ability is okay. Calculus, fine, I can do that. The kinds of things that the econometrics do, yeah, I can do most of it, but I cannot do what Milton Friedman could do, I am told, which is he would take a dense mathematical, technical article and he would read it like you and I might read a Harry Potter novel, just scanning down the page, instantly understand. I can't do that. I'm never going to be able to do that. But what I can do is if I get concrete examples, I can figure out what the math is doing. Excuse me. And so, in one sense, it is an inferior workaround because I would much rather have divine revelation.
Sure.
That's a lot more powerful. And I am willing to accept that the kinds of experiences that Catherine and friends of hers who share her ability have is way better than anything I have been able to acquire through my journey. But it's the best I can do. And it turns out that that is pretty helpful all in itself. So, with that as background, I set out to try to explore religion, and wait a minute. That's a trap. I started to make this sound coherent. That's not really, it wasn't a coherent process. So first, the first thing I really remember is being with Charles Krauthammer at a meeting of the Pariah Chess Club in about 1994, 1995. Why is it called the Pariah Chess Club, you may ask? The bell curve had come out a few months earlier, and Charles thought this was a good way of characterizing our little group. And Charles, I don't know how we got into it, but Charles said, he used the phrase, why is there something rather than nothing, to refer to the existence of the universe. Now, it will tell you how ignorant I was about this whole area that I thought was Charles's original insight. I'm sorry, it was Heidegger, and not just Heidegger, but there had been variations on it for centuries before. However, and for people who haven't heard the phrase, stop and think, why is there something rather than nothing? And it is a profound enough question that it forces you to take seriously what created all this. Now, there have been a couple of good books written giving explanations for why you don't have to believe in that. That you can say you can use quantum physics to come up with explanations. And I never bought them. And the reason I never bought them is I think that every cosmologist who tries to do that eventually is in the position of saying, okay, just grant me an initial miracle and I'll explain everything after that.
It's the old assume a ladder, but for physics.
Assume a ladder. And once I got that, I can take the Big Bang back to the first trillionth of a second. I can do all that, but I can't get to the zero moment of the creation of the universe. It's the old turtles all the way down story as well.
Right.
Because if I say, well, God created the universe, and you say, well, what created God? And it comes from the joke. Most people get the punchline, but we've got time. So the joke is that an astrophysicist is giving a lecture. He's explaining how the universe came to be, and a little old lady at the end of the lecture says, that's rubbish, that the Earth sits on the back of a giant turtle. The professor superciliously smiles and say, and what does the turtle rest on? And she says, very clever, young man. It's turtles all the way down. Well, I had to take seriously, as I thought about that, I believe in an act of creation somewhere there. Now, what the hell was it? I don't know. But this creative force, I can call it a mystery, but it really amounts to a very vague notion of God. That was nudge number one. But the second thing that happened that was decisive was several years later, and it wasn't nudge number two, it was my road to Damascus moment. And that was, I encountered the anthropic principle.
Mm-hmm.
The anthropic principle is different from intelligent design, which says that evolution can't explain the creation of the eye. Anthropic principle refers to the creation of the universe. And it's really easy to get too deep in the weeds on this, so let me make it as simple as I can. Theory of physics can explain a whole lot about the Big Bang. But in the course of the Big Bang, there are also what physicists sometimes refer to as brute facts. These are parameters that theory can't explain. They theoretically can take on all sorts of values. There are a bunch of those associated with the Big Bang. And here's the thing. It's like you have 30 dials. And the thing the machine is supposed to do won't work unless all 30 of those dials are set to very specific different settings. And the universe appears to have been set to a whole bunch of very specific settings. That means we have galaxies and stars and planets. And if those parameters had been tweaked even a little bit, the universe would not exist as we know it, would not permit life. The book I read, and this is a good entry point for listeners who want to look into this, is called Six Numbers, just Six Numbers. It's by Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal formerly at the Royal Society. He's not religious himself. Okay, so you have this situation where we are literally talking about the odds are trillions to 1 against having a universe that permits life. You have 3 options. And one is the uncurious one. We're alive, we're here, the universe exists. There's no point in worrying about it. I find that unsatisfactory. It seems to me that this Canadian philosopher can't remember his name, had the right analogy. He said, suppose you are sentenced to death by a firing squad of 100 expert marksmen, and they all miss. And he said, on the one hand, you are still alive, so you can say there's no point in thinking about it, but it's okay to be curious about why you're still alive. And is it a matter of chance, or does it sort of seem as if somebody handed down an order that everybody should miss? And to me, that's the plausible explanation. Now, physicists who resist the idea that the universe is intentionally created to create life, to permit life, came up with an alternative. And it's a very elaborate theory with lots of string theory behind it and the rest, which says we have multiple universes. And we happen to be in one that permits life, but there are lots of others that don't. Well, even thinking of 2 universes is kind of daunting. Are we really supposed to believe there are 2 places like this? But you don't need
I will say, I've always found the idea of 2 universes a much dumber possibility, much less plausible than a trillion universes, right? Because once you're handing out extra universes, why would you stop at 2?
That's right. You can buy in bulk. I can see that. However, when I said to Catherine that I didn't buy the multiple universes thing, she said, well, you still got a mystery.
Yeah.
You can say there are a trillion universes, but you're still back with the original mystery again. Anyway, for me, the hypothesis that I took tea and honey and everything.
Don't worry about it. Just
I will let them cut this out.
Yeah, we'll cut it out.
The hypothesis that the universe was created intentionally to permit life, I found myself believing while saying to myself, I can't believe I'm believing this. But once you say that, you are opening up a whole new range of possibilities regarding religion that did not exist before. Now I'm doing a monologue here, and
Yeah.
I've
So I just wanted you to get your fill out on this. So
mhm.
so here's the thing. So first of all, the case that you're making, and just since you kind of raised it as the Chekhov's gun of this about like what my own religious views are, I am not an atheist. I am perfect, and I'm more than agnostic. I mean, I believe there is a God. I do. The conclusions one draws from that, I think, are there's a richer menu than one than the one most people lay out from that. But fortunately, I'm not on the hot seat here. So, but one point I would make is I think the anthropic principle is really interesting. Um, it doesn't nothing that you've said so far. We'll just stipulate that there is a creator. There's a creative. I mean, if you say creative force, you are depersonalizing God to a way that is sort of icky. And if you say there was a will behind it, you're kind of personalizing God in a way that is also kind of icky,
Also
right?
icky, yeah.
Right. We just have to accept that there is this intelligence, this force, this create, this demiurge, whatever we're going to call it, right? This thing out there that, with some intentionality, created the universe. It doesn't necessarily mean it created it for us. There could be 7 galaxies away a much better species than us that God had in mind, and is like, those hairless apes. That's one of the prices I had to pay to create these wonderful bee creatures over in Galaxy 742 or whatever, right? Or like there was a generally terrible Star Trek movie. I think it was Star Trek 4, where it turned out the Deus Ex Machina like aliens who were harassing Earth. It turns out they were pissed off because they were trying to talk to whales. And we had killed all our whales, so the Enterprise had to go back in time and get some whales to talk to them to convince them not to destroy the Earth. It is possible, given that you still believe in evolution, that we could be the dinosaurs to the really spectacularly moral bees or German Shepherd descendants that are coming next, and that we are a necessary phase for them. I'm not saying I believe any of this. All I'm saying is that the first layer of your proof that there's a God or intentionality here does not by itself force me to be Jew, Christian, Hindu, or anything else. It just forces me to account for the likelihood or reality, however you want to put it, that there is a creative force outside of myself that has a greater grasp of the purpose and point of the universe. And but that is probably not going to come to my rescue if I get stuck in traffic. All right.
I agree with everything you've said. In fact, I didn't even go further. All of the intentionality says that there was some kind of intentionality. Maybe life was a byproduct of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not only true of us, it's true of all the other ones in the other galaxies that, yeah, life existed, but really he had something else in mind. Okay, you're right. It does not push you any further. So now that gives us a segue into the really weird stuff. And here's where I wrote a couple of chapters, or a particular chapter, and I said to myself, a whole bunch of people who I admire and whose good opinion I want are going to say Charles has lost it. And so here we go. The title of the chapter is Challenges to Materialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I have come to believe that there is good evidence that consciousness exists independently of the brain. And another way of thinking about that is, I think evidence exists that we may have something that can easily be called a soul. And this is pushing us a lot deeper, Jonah, into the, well, we're now talking about human beings being quite different from what we have believed in the past. That's certainly true with me. I've got a couple of different sources of evidence for that belief. One of them is near-death experiences. And if for listeners who have not gotten into that literature, I've got news for you. Is there some really silly stuff out there about near-death experiences? Yeah, there are. There some books that make me roll my eyes? Yeah. Is there also a lot of very serious evidence about near-death experiences, which is really hard to explain? And that's also true. I'm not talking so much about the visions of the afterlife with the tunnel and the light and the being at the end of it and the sense of pervasive love, which are very common reports of near-death experiences. I'm not making a judgment about that. I'm making a judgment about a person who is clinically dead. No heartbeat, no respiration, no brainstem waves you can detect, who reports a conversation that occurred while he was in that state between the surgeon and the nurse. Or someone who remembers that the nurse took his dentures and put them in a particular drawer in a particular place. Insofar as you have independent witnesses who say that this event occurred, and you have clinical evidence that the guy was dead, tell me how that knowledge was transmitted to him, unless you say the brain functions independently of the mind. And there are very well documented cases of exactly that kind of mysterious transmission of information. The even more hard to refute evidence, I think, comes from a lesser known phenomenon called terminal lucidity. And in this case, I've got to say that my mother, who had advanced dementia, had a short period, which sounds very much like that, which I did not personally witness. So I'm not going to use that as testimony. But terminal lucidity refers to people who have, again, documented physiological disorganization of the brain, such that current neuroscience tells us their brains are incapable of organized thought of any kind. Advanced dementia, certain kinds of strokes, certain kinds of meningitis. This is so common that if you go talk to a staff in a hospice, odds are there will be members of that staff who have witnessed this phenomenon, that a day or so before a person dies, they're back. Somebody who has not recognized spouse or children for years, who has not said a word for years, suddenly recognizes them, has memories, exhibits the same personality characteristics they always had, lasts maybe 15 minutes, maybe lasts an hour or two at max. A day or two later, they're dead. And once again, if you have multiple witnesses, including medical personnel who record the clinical details, and if you have the medical evidence of this kind of disorganization in the brain, you tell me, how did that happen unless there is consciousness independently of the brain?
Okay, so I very much want to help you move books, because that is part of the point of this podcast. I get the best guests because they know I can move books. So I'm going to skip asking you about the Shroud of Turin and just tell listeners that you have a provocative case for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin in your book, because I want to get to, and if you force on me your explanation of Turin, that's fine. You're under no obligation to follow my roadmap. But I do want to get to sort of a more fundamental question, and we should probably figure out a way to sneak in some C.S. Lewis and the case for the authenticity of Jesus and whatnot. But which sounds like a really arrogant sentence now that I think about it. The case for the authenticity of Jesus and whatnot. I apologize if that sounded dismissive. That was not my point. But my burning question is, why not call it taking faith seriously? And the reason, what I mean is, religion is, I mean, I understand that colloquially religion means something slightly different than its etymology would suggest, but religion is, I think, still also, it's the people say I'm spiritual, not religious. That's what that a very annoying phrase gets at. Um, Religion is a body of rules, dogmas, institutional, sacral, but still bureaucratic norms and expectations, rights, all of these sorts of things. Um, and the argument for the existence of God is not necessarily the argument for any specific denomination, any specific sect, any specific set of rituals. And look, my people, the people I am mostly descended from, sort of, even though my mom was Episcopalian and whatnot, but was raised Jewish. That's how I identify myself. There are Jews who would literally argue all day long about why on Wednesday the sun rose at 7:02, and why wouldn't God want it to rise at 7:01 or 7:03? And then they would get fights about it in some Polish shul, right? Like my people like these arguments, and I am inclined towards these arguments. But there is nothing inherent in anything that you've said so far that says Christianity is right and Islam is wrong, or Judaism is right and Christianity is wrong, or Hinduism, that's a wacky Japanese game show of a religion in a lot of ways, but whatever. My only point is, even if I'm willing to leap the canyon about belief versus unbelief, you are asking in many ways to leap several canyons, and you move into a argument about being a Christian, which seems to me you're asking people to do something you're criticizing others for doing, which is not just simply believing in one miracle, but a series of miracles, right? And how do you think about that?
First response is, why use taking religion seriously instead of taking faith seriously? And instead of trying to come up with a deep answer to that, in a way, I don't like I find more problem with faith than I do with religion. Mm-hmm. Because religion can also simply refer to different sets of beliefs. That's true. And I'm saying, well, take those sets of beliefs seriously. But faith is a really problematic thing for people like me who do not have this spiritual sensitivity. That gene, yeah. I just hate to say, well, I don't have any good reason for believing this, but I still believe it. And a lot of people would say, you are just missing the point, Murray, completely. That's taking that leap that's absolutely essential. Okay, maybe so, but I can't do that. That's one response. The other response is, the book actually is very explicit about that. So I've got part 1, which is titled Taking God Seriously. And then I've got part 2, Taking Christianity Seriously. And if you ever get around to reading the opening paragraph of part 2, I say in there, well, now I'm going to get into Christianity. And some of you, I'm asking you to go too far.
Yeah.
I'm asking you to interpret texts that are 2,000 years old, and this can sound to a lot of you as a really kind of nonsensical thing to do. And I understand, but and then I say, I have a sentence to the effect that, but a lot of this is intellectually very interesting, so you might want to give it a try anyway. And furthermore, when I get to the final chapter, which, as I've always had problems with final chapters because I'm supposed to pose solutions, and I don't do that very well. But in the final chapter, the things that I sort of say, this is what I think applies to all of you meaning people like me, and they do not have anything specifically to do with Christianity. And then after that, I say, okay, if I'm going to write a book about taking things religion seriously, I should tell you what it's done for me. Mm-hmm. And now I'll give you a set of things. And those do involve some Christian beliefs. But basically, I'm saying for those who are trying to decide whether they want to read this thing, I do not proselytize for Christianity. In a sense, I do because I make it clear I think there's a lot more depth and stuff to traditional Christian belief than I had realized before. But I'm saying taking religion seriously does not mean becoming a Christian. So you've got that separation.
Okay, so I want to get it on the record that I think you're doing yourself and a bunch of the rest of us a little bit of a disservice in the origin story and the setup of the title. And what I mean by that is, it's sort of on the bingo card for this podcast. I've made this point many, many times that one of the criteria or the heuristics or whatever that William F. Buckley applied for whether or not you could be part of the broad sweep of the mainstream conservative movement wasn't that you had to be religious. You could even be atheist, but you had to have respect for the transcendent. You had to have respect for people who were religious, and also for the important role that religion plays in Western civilization and human development and moral progress, and we can go down a very long list. And when I think about the people who were sort of on your team prior to your discovery of your quest for religion, it's people like Irving Kristol, who was a friend of yours and was sort of a role model for me, but I did not know him well. Who made exactly that point, is that you had to have respect for religion. You had to take religion seriously as a sociological phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon. You had to take people who were religious seriously because they were serious people. And I know you can do chapter and verse on this because of this book, but also of Human Accomplishment, a book I reviewed for the late Weekly Standard, is to go and try and find the important scientists who didn't believe in God is much harder than to find all of them thought they were in the process of revealing God's truth, right? And God's plan and whatnot. And so I think the reason I brought up why not faith instead of religion is that I think you always took religion seriously as a mode of social organization and a source of meaning and purpose in people's lives. What you didn't take seriously, in the way I'm reading you, and you can completely reject me if I'm being unfair, was the faith part of it. Was the actual belief that holds up the mouse in the massive Rube Goldberg machine of organized religion, of actual faith that spins the little wheel that makes it all worth doing. That was the part you had a problem with, but it wasn't religion itself. Is that a misreading, or am I exaggerating the issue?
No, you stated very well my views of religion. I've always had respect for it.
You were never a Randian who mocked people who believed in God or anything.
And not even close to a Dawkins kind of person, or for that matter, Christopher Hitchens. But what I mean by taking religion seriously, and now that you've prompted me to have this insight that I didn't have before, I don't consider I was taking religion seriously. In the sense that I was saying it's extremely useful for society, but I was not willing to take seriously the possible truth value of religion. And the thing that I have done in this book is basically tell people, this is why now I'm not talking about religion in terms of its utility. I'm saying I think there's a lot of truth in there. And I'm still willing to be and still have a lot of complications that I'm willing to recognize in saying I'm going to choose Christianity in favor of something else. Want me to throw in another weird little bit of knowledge that's out there that has a hard time getting a hearing? Buddhism, of course, and Hinduism too, for that matter, reincarnation is an absolutely central part of their religious dogmas.
Mm-hmm.
It's very thoroughly articulated. Are you aware that there's a hell of a lot of very solid evidence for reincarnation? There is. There was a guy named Ian Stevenson, who was at the University of Virginia, who spent his career on this, and he got the respect of other scientists for the care in which he went out and got these stories. And there is still a division of perceptual studies or something at the University of Virginia's medical school where students of his, now full professors, continue to accumulate this. And it's interesting enough that I'll just give you just another minute on this. Just as the near-death experiences include things that are really hard to explain without saying there's consciousness independently of the brain, there are memories that 6 and 7 and 8-year-old children have, which are verifiable, specific, about people who had died years before they were born.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't go any place with this information in the book. I have just a little box mentioning that it exists. And this is one case where it doesn't have to be reincarnation. It can be a weird transmission of memories, which in itself be very important to recognize it's true. I'm just saying that when I avoid pushing people toward one religion, it is partly because I think the truth values associated with Buddhism and Taoism especially are, not to mention Judaism, are quite impressive. And now I'm taking maybe the soft way out, saying, well, all the great religions have hold of some of the truth. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I'm taking the easy way out, but it has the advantage of being true, I think, to a large degree.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I can think of other First of all, I can think of other explanations for these memories kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a big thing in science fiction about access to genetic memories. There's the whole Jung stuff, which I don't have much time for. But I do want to, because I am curious about this. I make jokes about this all the time. I don't know how much you follow this part of the crazy new right, but there's a part of the new right that is obsessed with the idea, as Tucker Carlson was just saying again the other day, that feudalism was a better system to what we have today, right? And I don't want to get deep in the weeds on it, but like it is a thing. There are books been written about it. There are people think because they had an integral social order that serfdom really wasn't that bad, and yada yada yada. And then there's this other thing that's much more mainstream about people thinking they'd be happier in the Roman Empire. And I always make jokes about this because to me it feels very much like the 1970s fad with reincarnation. Nobody thinks, like every time they talked about how they were reincarnated, they were always one of the Romanovs or, an emperor. They were never some peg-legged serf who had dysentery and died, at 12 or whatever. And so I'm just kind of curious, in the more serious studies of reincarnation, do the people's past lives, do they ever suck?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because that's an important thing. Because you never hear those stories, right?
And they're routinely ordinary people. In fact, I don't know of any of the serious case studies which somebody is remembering a famous person.
Okay.
That's not what they do. No.
Okay,
but I agree with you about there are lots of other explanations for this, and I'm not going to go into the Jungian thing either. But there are so many things in nature whereby you teach, or I should say, birds in northern England learn how to open milk bottles, and birds in Australia a few weeks later are doing. I mean, this I won't get into. I'm just saying there's a lot of really strange stuff out there, and I don't automatically discount any of it.
Okay, so that's probably as close as I'm going to get to a place to segue to talk about the role of C.S. Lewis, and particularly what does he call it? The trilemma.
Yep.
Oh, I should say, just because it was on front of mind about the earlier when you said you didn't take religion seriously, I, I I always hate making this point to people because I'm not a huge Napoleon fan, but the sort of Irving Kristol, Jonah Goldberg, Charles Murray position on about William F. Buckley to a certain extent of taking religion seriously was in some ways first articulated by Napoleon, because he had that famous line where he said, I looked it up, religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quite quiet. Religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. And he famously said, in religion, I did not see the mystery of the incarnation, but the mystery of the social order. He thought, it's funny, he was making essentially the Marxist case that it's the opiate of the masses, but it's a good thing. And I don't think that's really fair to us or to Irving or to you or anything like that. But there is an element of that I think there's a certain condescension that comes with talking about how religion is good for people, but not for me, that I think I can sometimes lapse into and that other people can lapse into.
I agree with all that.
Yeah. All right. So, C.S. Lewis and the trilemma. Why don't we sort of take it from there?
Okay. C.S. Lewis wrote a book. It was actually a series of radio lectures he gave during World War II that he then converted into this little slim book called Mere Christianity. And it was published, I think, the first time in the late 1940s. C.S. Lewis, of course, Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia, but also he was an Oxford Don, incredibly erudite about the classics. I mean, you talk about a smart person who still believes that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the advantage for someone like me in reading Mere Christianity, which is I read that book at the behest of a mutual friend of ours, Pete Wayner, who is an evangelical Christian. And I read it from cover to cover. And it was this wonderful experience of a very smart person making a case that I was resisting, but he made it so well that I couldn't get it out of my mind. And the initial part of the case has nothing to do with Christianity specifically, but with the moral law. Mm-hmm. And C.S. Lewis making the case that there is a moral law that human beings share that is not explained by evolution. It's not explained simply by, reciprocal altruism where I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, which evolutionary psychology can explain, but rather there is such a thing as standards of decent behavior which seem to be deeply embedded in the human psyche. And C.S. Lewis makes a case for saying that they are God-given. And as I say, I don't know of any concept that I dealt with in this course of my religious journey where I have tried as hard internally to dismiss it and had superficial reasons for dismissing it that I eventually rejected as inadequate. So anyway, the book itself, I recommend to anyone just as an intellectual exercise, but it did force me to confront this famous trilemma. Because at one point, C.S. Lewis says, here's what you must not say about Jesus of Nazareth, that he was a wise moral teacher, but he was not the Son of God. And Lewis says, that's the one thing you can't say about it. That any man who made the statements he made about his relationship to God is one of three things. He is lying, or he is a lunatic. And he has this wonderful phrase, he is a lunatic on a level with a man who thinks he is a poached egg. that rational human beings do not claim to be anything resembling the Son of God. Or the third is that he's the Son of God. Well, I don't think those are your choices. And there are a whole bunch of others, critics, who don't think those are the choices either.
I think he's the Son of God, which I'm just saying that I agree with you. There are more than three options there.
Well, yeah, but thinking you're the Son of God is not that far from thinking you're a poached egg. But I think I give Lewis that credit for that. But the other explanations are that the Gospels simply are not accurate representations of how Jesus represented himself.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of translation issues that are quite serious in this. So
For sure.
Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man a lot. Well, that has biblical antecedents, but it's does that mean Son of God? And a whole bunch of other things. Or for example, there are the passages where no one gets to God except through me, uh, believing in me. And there's other translations say that could be believe me
Mm-hmm.
about God. And so there are lots of issues for saying no. Jesus never claimed to have that kind of position. But the power of the trilemma is that I can't just say that. If I want to start saying maybe there's something in Christianity, I got to start looking into the historicity of the Bible, and that takes you down all sorts of paths. Now, mind you, my wife, Catherine, at the point I'm doing all this, is rolling her eyes, saying, Charles, 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 you are missing the point. The point of all this is to be able to enter into contemplation of really important issues of the human condition and trying to get insight into that and get insight into what it would mean to say that God is love and a variety of other things that are way more important than whether Jesus walked on water and way more important than whether Jesus was the Son of God. And I say, Catherine, you're right, but I'm still curious. And I got into this, full disclosure, I get really irritated with the postmoderns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Postmodernist literary criticism and postmodernist history and all the rest of that. And I read that and I say, this sounds really erudite. And there's way simpler explanations for this.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about the revisionists regarding the New Testament. That they're very erudite. And they also seem to me to be coming up with really complicated explanations that have much simpler ones. I won't go on a rant on this. I'll just make a few assertions. One of them is that among the revisionists, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by any of those people.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they weren't even written as in any meaningful sense. You had traditions that were handed down verbally, and people all over the Roman Empire who become Christians sort of put these together anonymously, and they sort of coalesced, and they were arbitrarily chosen by the Council of Nicaea or whatever. I think that there is really good historical evidence from the very early church which says Matthew was written by the disciple named Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
Mark was written by Mark, who essentially was interviewing Peter and taking down Peter's reminiscences. Luke was, in fact, written by a physician named Luke, who traveled with Paul. And John was, in fact, written by the disciple of Jesus named John. And I think there is also very good evidence, taking the totality of what we know, to say that the Gospels were not put together in 70 or 80 or 90 of the first century. That it's much more likely that they were written between 40 and 60, which is only a couple of decades after the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And, you know, histories of Ronald Reagan written in 2000 or 2010 is still recent enough that you can get a pretty accurate sense. So I have given 90 seconds. I've given 90 seconds of issues which have acquired libraries of books written about them. But that's where I kind of came out. And I'm saying you have to take the New Testament seriously. It's got a lot more going for it than I'd realized.
Okay. Again, it feels a bit icky to do it this way, but lightning round. Heaven and hell. Not pro and con, but yes or no. Like, how convinced are you of their existence, and is it the same level of confidence for both?
I am going to give you a probabilistic answer.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell? I'm a statistician. What do you think I'm going to give
I
you?
know. Well, I'm sure listeners out there are rolling their eyes, but I'm not. I've known you for 30 years. So.
I think that it is quite likely that there is a life after death.
Mm-hmm.
I have no confident sense of its contours. I'm kind of optimistic given the totality of the evidence from near-death experiences, but I won't go much farther than that. I do not think that God is a judgmental God in terms of consigning people to hell. I have this is a personal belief.
Mm-hmm.
I do not urge anybody else to share it. It's almost a way for me to think about it. And that is that one of the aspects of the near-death experience is that people have real moral clarity about their lives. Well, suppose that moral clarity consists of recognizing the things you've done that are really awful, that are not explained by your environment, they're not explained by your genes. You were just behaving badly in a big way. You do that enough, and you have moral clarity about your life, and you're going to feel awful about it, all right? And you take that to extremes, and it's something resembling hell. And I don't go any further than saying I find that an interesting hypothesis. The other sort of theological way of looking at it was suggested to me by Michael Novak, and I'll just say this and stop. God doesn't consign you to hell. You are invited into a relationship with God, and if you choose not to accept that invitation, you're sort of in a kind of hell.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, some of this is sort of linguistic lily gilding, but so be it. I will often, in fact, it's one of my go-to phrases for if I have to sign a lot of books is I'll remind people despair is a sin, and the actual etymology or the actual history of why despair is considered the worst in some traditions, the worst Christian sin, is because technically what despair is the belief that you're beyond the salvation of God, that God has completely forsaken you, and there's nothing you can do to get back on his good side, and that means you are actually denying the power of God and the righteousness of God and the supremacy of God, because you're saying not, it's like declaring yourself a moral boulder so heavy not even God can lift you, and I think it's a very useful way of thinking about things, even if I'm not on the same page necessarily as you, and sort of gets at a very similar point, because the depths of despair very hard to distinguish from personal hell, right? Okay, this gets back to my question about religion versus faith. How bought into the Nicene Creed are you?
I am pretty far from being bought in.
Because you're afraid of your wife, for starters.
That's right. And with the Nicene Creed, the stumbling point there for me, of course, is the resurrection. And I'm there's a.
So do you doubt the resurrection? I mean, what do you mean the stumbling point there?
It's asking a lot to believe that somebody was raised from the dead, and as Jesus was in the resurrection story. It is also hard to come up with persuasive reasons for saying that it was made up. There is a very lovely way of putting it that a guy named Polkinghorne, a British bishop who actually became a bishop after many years as a mathematical physicist at Oxford, And he says, well, he considers a lot of these things capable of, it's possible to look at these things with a great deal of flexibility. And he says of the resurrection that, do I believe that in some sense the Jesus of Palestine 2,000 years ago is still alive for believers in Christianity, that he was raised in some sense, whether bodily or not. And he says that's the most consistent with what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's got a lot of caveats put in it, and I can deal with that. However, I will say, since you mentioned that I've got the thing about the Shroud of Turin, that if they come, they've got one way of dating the Shroud of Turin that puts it at 2,000 years, and they've got a lot of evidence that the carbon dating was botched. And so if they can come up with a reinforcement for 2,000-year date for the Shroud of Turin, I'm going to have a really hard time denying the physical resurrection. That's how weird that object is. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so this is a good place. I know you're pressed for time, and I want to honor the commitment. But so first of all, when you were talking at the beginning about the difference between people who have an innate sense for religion and people who have to work on it, the analogy that popped into my head and has been staying with me ever since is the difference between marriages that are formed at love at first sight and arranged marriages, or marriages that require a lot more work. But you actually do, if you want to go by the data, there are a lot of arranged marriages that ended with a lot more satisfaction than the romantic puppy love marriages did. And which is just simply to say that some of the most important things in life require work from you, right? And I don't want to sound like a Hallmark Channel special, but sometimes the journey is the point, not necessarily the destination. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. But in your journey to find God, or to find religion, or to find an explanation to these things, I think you'll admit that, I mean, I've heard you basically say it here and elsewhere, that one of the things that you enjoyed about writing this book was it was a bit of an intellectual scavenger hunt. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with that. I love intellectual scavenger hunt. The thing is, I assume you also agree that the evidence for the existence of God is sufficiently hidden that the phrase scavenger hunt works, right? If it were out in plain sight, there would be no agnostics. There would be no atheists. And so I guess the question I have for you is, there's that line, which I mentioned to you before, from Tertullian, that, is one of the things that distinguishes Christianity from Judaism and Islam, about we believe because it is absurd, right? Is this idea that it is inexplicable through rational means, that is the core of our faith, is, for Christians, is this miracle and the resurrection and all the rest. If that's the point, if you have to have a Kierkegaardian leap, if you have to just sort of at some point stand on the cliffside and jump in order to really get into this stuff, why hide any evidence at all? Like, it's sort of like the anthropic principle, but for empiricism. He left enough clues and Easter eggs out that you could find them to your satisfaction, and I accept that, given your intellect, that's a pretty high bar, and it's a bar that a lot of other people can't hit. So, like, why, if there's an intentionality to this, why not leave better clues for people to find? Because you're in effect saving souls if they find them. Or if the whole point is the absurdity and I don't mean absurdity in a pejorative sense, I mean the sort of irrationality, the mystery of it. If the point is the mystery, why not cover your tracks even better? Like, why is it this perfect? Why is it this level that Charles Murray can figure this out, who's sort of the social scientist version of a Sherlock Holmes, but a CPA might have trouble finding.
I state early on, I think when I start the Big Bang chapter, I want to make my amateur standing explicit. If you are going to take religion seriously, you have to accept that you are going to enter into subjects that you do not have the option of mastering. And if you don't have the option of mastering them, then you are in a process of doing the best you can. So should anybody take my statements about the Big Bang, the physics of the Big Bang, over that of an actual physicist, then the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And I take some positions on the historicity of the Bible, and I again remind my readers, you would be right to doubt me as my erudition on biblical historicity. I've given you a bunch of sources that I've used, but I'm echoing what you said. I say that you have to do your own homework on this.
Right.
That I'm offering you an example of how it worked for me, and you can take what I have in this book, and especially the reading lists, and you can use that to help you on your own quest. But this is not Charles Murray who says, folks, I figured it out.
Okay, that's fair.
I said, It's Charles Murray who has reached a destination that is a whole lot better than having not taken the trip at all. And
so I find that an utterly persuasive and wonderful defense of the book and your point and your purpose in writing the book. But I think my question still hangs out there, which is, if God wants you to, if the Christian God wants you to make a leap of faith, right? I mean, I've heard this from other religious, I've asked versions of this question of a lot of religious people, is like, he wants you to take a leap of faith, right? So like, if he just lays it all out in front of you and gives you all the evidence, then you're going to get people who sort of, I think it's Pascal's wager, people who are going to just simply believe in God to cover their ass, right? Rather than make this leap. It's very easy to believe in God if God is daily visiting sort of inexplicable miracles on you. It's another thing that requires you to sort of make that leap, and which is why he hides his intent behind the world in some respect. Why do that? I'm not asking for a definitive answer. I'm asking for your guess as to the point of him leaving clues that he exists, that you think you found, that have persuaded you to your satisfaction, but doesn't provide more clues to bring more of his potential flock home.
Okay, let me put it in the way that another analogy that I used to close the book, actually, this is all very well timed. I think Catherine experiences that faith. Mm-hmm. And others of our friends, one of them was at the dinner the other night that you attended. I think they experience the reality of God in a way that does not require them to leap off the cliff. Mm-hmm. They have leapt off the cliff and they are down on the seashore gathering seashells. They're doing fine. And I think of the analogy of me being this kid watching a party on the other side of the glass and his nose pressed against the window, wishing he could join that party. I am in the position of envying Catherine, of wishing that I could experience what she experiences, and I have not given up hope of it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep trying. But I'm saying, no, I can't find the edge of the cliff to leap off of. I'm trying to come up with a way of explaining it.
I truly get what you're saying. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, there's something like 2% of the population, something like that, that can see, like when they look at a rainbow, they can see like 2 or 3 more colors than the rest of us can, because their eyes just have, they can pick up these colors that normal vision is invisible. And there's some rock shrimp that can like see 26 colors of the spectrum when we can see like 5. And
Mm-hmm.
these and I take your point that there are people who I think are just simply in the same way that some people have higher EQ and can just read people better, and there are some people who can smell things better. I think there is a religious sense that makes people more attuned to it. This does not necessarily mean that because they have it, it proves the existence of God and all these things, but there's definitely some truth to that. It feels to me, and I get the point. For some people, it takes the work, right? And for other people, they take it on faith, and that I believe. And it doesn't mean that one group is smarter than the other.
I walk away from most conversation, Jonah, saying, Jonah's just like me. he's he's not a Christian, but I mean, basically, you are as you've got your nose pressed against the glass, just like me. I think. I would be curious to know if Jessica has a different relationship to all this than you do.
Um, I You have been working on a book where you have been given permission to discuss your
Okay.
wife's relationship with religion in ways that I have not gotten advance clearance. So I will just say we have a mixed marriage, and she considers herself a Catholic. How guilty she feels is depends on is something I'll have to ask her. Um, but no, I mean, I'm with you. I think that they're in this respect. I think it is just friggin' when you look at quantum physics and you look at um, just the sheer size and scope of the universe, um, the idea that we've got it all figured out, and that um, and that we should not have any sort of epistemological doubt is crazy to me. That doesn't mean I'm an agnostic, but I also believe that my leap of faith is a leap of faith. I I do not want to argue with an atheist who wants to make the case that God doesn't exist any more than I really want to argue with someone who says if I don't accept their doctrines, I'm going to hell. It's like, you know, just I don't think there's anything fruitful that will come out of it. But this I find useful. It's an exploration of like trying to figure out things to your own satisfaction, and I think that's admirable and really really interesting. One last question on all this, and then
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you go. I should let you know that the backdrop of this is in part I wanted to have a guest on recently to answer sort of all the questions about religion that people feel too embarrassed or too stupid to ask. And I ended up getting this very interesting guy who's a Dominican priest who we had to retrofit the episode because it turns out it became all the questions you want to ask about Catholicism, but we're afraid to ask because he was very much inside the four corners of his own faith. There's nothing wrong with that. It was difficult to get him out of that mode. But the first question I asked him, which is one I used to talk to Michael Novak about, is prayer. What is the point of prayer? If God's will is God's will, I mean, I should have asked you whether you believe in free will, or if that the fate of the universe is locked in. But if prayer, why do people pray for better outcomes? If God's will is God's will, and what will be, is it him acknowledging that he'll change his mind based upon whether the sincerity of somebody else's prayer, or is it about just getting you closer to God? Do you have a strong view on prayer and what it's actually for and the utility of it?
I have come to understand that prayer is way more complicated than I ever realized. That a lot of what Catherine is engaged in is a kind of prayer,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a dialogue. It is a way of entering into a dialogue with God. And then I had my own one experience, which was back in the 1990s when I was not very far along in all this. but I can't remember why. But one Sunday at Quaker meeting, uh, I had something that was really bothering me, and so I decided I was going to pray about it. And I did my very best to pray very earnestly. And in the next couple of days, I found myself at ease with this thing that had been bothering me. Can't remember what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I never prayed again. And what happened, it wasn't that prayer failed, it's that it worked. and so I indicate this elsewhere in the book too. There's parts of me that really fight this there are some inner parts of my personality and so forth that is really scared of jumping off the end of the cliff, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an indication of that. So actually, maybe I'm presenting for my readers, listen, if I can make it work, anybody can make it work, because I am as hard a case as you're ever going to find for someone who is dragged kicking and screaming into taking religion seriously, but it turned out to be possible.
Yeah, I will say one of the things I like about your approach is I don't think you're the hardest case. I think you are, because you never had contempt for religious people.
Yeah.
In my experience, and the hardest cases. I mean, I think Hitchens would have been much harder because there was so much ego and arrogance. And I knew Hitchens pretty well. I admire the guy in many ways. Had profound differences in others, but he had looked down with such contempt at the people who were religious. The idea of conceding they were right, I think, would be much more psychically painful than you saying, "Oh, turns out Michael Novak was right." Well, I always thought Michael Novak was brilliant. Okay, that's great to hear. And I just don't think it's a painful thing for you in a way that for the sort of like for Richard Dawkins to say my entire life work was wrong, it would be very, very painful. This is not the same thing for you. And but I get it, and anyway, the point I was going to make is for the people who go through that pain and go out on the other side, the passion of the convert is as annoying, like the hyper atheist who then becomes born again is as annoying as the hyper atheist, right? Is this because they have to commit wholeheartedly to the whole thing that they once condemned. And I just think reality is sufficiently mysterious that you have to be a little more supple and a little more humble about these things, and have, to use a religious word, a little more grace for people who disagree with you about unknowable things.
The good news here is that the best people who are deeply religious are exactly the way you want them to be.
Yeah.
And I've had the good fortune, for reasons I won't go into, to meet several of those people in the Christian faith who are, well, one of them is Francis Collins, who of course written a book, but apparently he was one of the few people who got to Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens liked him and sort of had to recognize he had something, that a man he could respect, that he had to deal with. So it's true, there are the passionate born again, and they are just as annoying as the hyper atheists. One of the things that I think argues well for the best Christians I have known, and I think probably would argue well for the best Jews that I could know in terms of religious Jews, is a deep kind of love, which they don't make a big deal of saying, but I feel I'm in the presence of people who are experiencing the kind of love that we are supposed to associate with the best religions.
And with that, as good a place as any to stop. Charles Murray, thank you so much for doing this, and I hope you'll come back.
I have so much fun doing this, Jonah. I hope I come back too.